When he realized that he would be relegated to more prosaic duties, he quickly quit in disgust and sent a letter to Washington protesting that less qualified men had been promoted ahead of him. He then went to work for Major General Israel Putnam. Something about Aaron Burr, his penchant for intrigue, a lack of sufficient difference, perhaps his insatiable chasing after women grated on George Washington. Much of Burr's political future was shaped by his decidedly cool wartime relations with Washington, while other contemporaries, Hamilton being the prime example, profited from the general's approbation. During this period, Washington was at least marginally aware of Hamilton, an exacting captain. Hamilton ordered the arrest of a sergeant, 2 corporals, and a private for mutiny, as they received mild punishments in a court-martial. Washington pardoned the 2 principal offenders before issuing general orders for Hamilton to assemble his company on May 15, 1776, at 10 o'clock next Saturday morning upon the Common. A month later, as we learn from the Royal Danish American Gazette, Hamilton gallantly led a nighttime attack of 100 men against the Sandy Hook lighthouse outside New York Harbor. I continued the attack for 2 hours with field pieces and small arms. The war correspondent cum artillery captain reported, being all that time between 2 smart fires from the shipping and the lighthouse, but could make no impression on the walls. Hamilton did not lose any men, and said the raid miscarried because he lacked sufficient munitions, and because the enemy had been tipped off to the attack. With the speed of youthful dreams, Hamilton had moved from the fantasy to the reality of combat leadership. Back in Manhattan, the young captain found a city engaged in a spree of wanton violence against Tory sympathizers. Many loyalists were subjected to a harrowing ritual known as riding the rail, in which they were carried through the streets sitting astride a sharp rail borne by 2 tall, strong men. The prisoners' names were proclaimed at each street corner as speculators lustily cheered their humiliation. One bystander reported, "We had some grand Tory rides in the city this week. Several of them were handled very roughly, being carried through the streets on rails, their clothes torn off their backs, and their bodies pretty well mingled with the dust. There is hardly a Tory face to be seen this morning." Because New York had been a citadel of Tory sentiment, there was a pervasive fear of clandestine plots being hatched against Washington, whose capture or assassination would have been an inestimable prize to the British. Indeed, the former New York governor, William Tryon, tried to orchestrate just such a plan. On June 21st, as Hamilton returned from Sandy Hook, a cabal to murder General Washington and recruit a loyalist force to aid the British was laid bare. New York's Tory Mayor, David Matthews, was charged with dangerous designs and treasonable conspiracies against the rights and liberties of the United Colonies of America. Others implicated in this shocking plot included several members of Washington's personal guard, especially Sergeant Thomas Hickey. Mayor Matthews admitted to having contact with the British and was imprisoned in Connecticut, but a defiant Hickey produced no witnesses at his court material and was sentenced to death. Hamilton regaled his St. Croix readers with this dramatic events, telling them that a most barbarous and infernal plot has been discovered among our Tories. He sketched a widespread conspiracy, the goal of which was to murder all the staff of ficers, blow up the magazines, and secure the passes of the town. On June 28th, nearly 20,000 spectators, virtually every person still in town, Hamilton included, turned out in a meadow near the Bowery to watch Thomas Hickey mount the gallows. The prisoner had remained unrepentant, and Washington decided to make an example of him. Hickey waived the presence of a chaplain, explaining that they are all cutthroats. He kept up his air of bravado until the hangman slipped the noose and blindfold over his head, at which point he briefly wiped away tears. Moments later, his body hung slack from the gallows. In his second dispatch on this sensational event, Hamilton applauded Washington's swift justice. It is hoped the remainder of those miscreants now in our possession will meet with a punishment adequate to their crimes. Hamilton might have ended his dispatch there. Instead, in a curious non sequitur, the future Treasury Secretary reported rumors that copper coins made with base metal alloys would be called in, possibly replaced by new continental copper coins of larger size. Evidently, the young captain was boning up on monetary policy. Within days of Hickey's execution, King George III revealed just how far he was prepared to go to crush his refractory colonies. The world's foremost naval power began to gather a massive armada of battleships and transports at Sandy Hook, the prelude to the largest amphibious assault of the 18th century. An assemblage of military might was soon marshaled, some 300 ships and 32,000 men, including 8,400 Hayesian mercenaries, a fighting force designed expressly to intimidate the Americans and restore them to their sanity through a terrifying show of strength. The British had so many troops stationed aboard this floating city that they surpassed in numbers the patriotic soldiers and citizens left facing them in New York. Entrenched in southern Manhattan, with fewer than 20,000 inexperienced soldiers at his disposal and lacking even a single warship, Washington must have wondered how he could possibly defeat this well-oiled fighting machine. He was making every preparation for an imminent assault. He wrote, but conceded that his army was extremely deficient in arms and in great distress for want of them. To remedy a grave shortage of ammunition, the New York Provincial Congress ordered that lead be peeled from roofs and windows and melted down to make bullets. So many trees had already been chopped down for firewood that New York resembled a ghost town. To see the vast number of houses shut up, one would think that the city almost evacuated. One fleeing Tory wrote, "Women and children are scarcely to be seen in the streets." On July 2nd, the British battle plan began to unfold as General William Howe directed ships, commanded by his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, to sail up through the Narrows. Thousands of redcoats disembarked on Staten Island. From Manhattan wharves and rooftops, Continental Army soldiers stared flabbergasted at the interminable procession of imposing vessels crowding into the harbor. Surveying a bay thick with British masts, one American soldier said that it resembled a wood of pine trees. "I could not believe my eyes. I declare that I thought all London was afloat," Captain Hamilton said. Captain Hamilton and his artillery company, posted at the battery, had an unobstructed view of the enemy. It seemed an inauspicious moment for the threatened colonies to declare independence, and yet that is exactly what they did. Faced with the military strength of the most colossal empire since ancient Rome, they decided to fight back. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress unanimously adopted a resolution calling for independence, with only New York abstaining. 2 days later, the Congress endorsed the Declaration of Independence in its final edited form. The actual signing was deferred until August 2nd. There was nothing impetuous or disorderly about this action. Even amid the state of open warfare, these law-abiding men felt obligated to issue a formal document, giving a dispassionate list of their reasons for secession. The solemn, courageous act flew in the face of a historical precedent. No colony had ever succeeded in breaking away from the mother country to set up a self-governing state, and the Declaration signers knew that the historical odds were heavily stacked against them. They further knew that treason was a crime punishable for death, a threat that scarcely seemed abstract as reports trickled into Philadelphia of the formidable fleet bearing down on New York. The Declaration of Independence did not achieve sacred status for many years, and was not even officially inscribed on parchment for another 2 weeks. Instead, a Philadelphia printer, John Dunlap, ran off about 500 broadsides that were distributed by fast riders through the colonies. On July 6, while Captain Hamilton wandered about trying to find a purse with money that he had lost, he sometimes had a touch with absent-minded genius. The local press announced independence. 2 days later, Washington held a printed copy of the Declaration in his hands for the first time. The next day, New York Provincial Congress ratified the document, and at 6 p.m., George Washington gathered all his troops on the Common, the very same Common where Hamilton had debuted as a speaker, to hear the stirring manifesto read out loud. As the rapt soldiers listened, they learned that the United Colonies of America had been declared free and independent states. The long-awaited words triggered a rush of patriotic exuberance. Militiamen and civilians barreled down Broadway, destroying every relic of British influence in their path, including royal arms painted on tavern signs. At Bowling Green, at the foot of Broadway, they mobbed a gilded equestrian statue of George III, portrayed in Roman garb, that had been erected to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. John Adams had once admired this beautiful ellipsis of land, railed in with solid iron, in the center of which a statue of His Majesty on horseback, very large, of solid lead, gilded with gold, on a pedestal of marble very high. Now, for reasons both symbolic and practical, the crowd pulled George III down from his pedestal, decapitating him in the process. The 4,000 pounds of gilded lead was rushed off to Litchfield, Connecticut, where it was melted down to make 42,088 musket bullets. One wit predicted that the king's soldiers will probably have melted Majesty fired at them. The action boosted morale in the besieged city at the time of imminent peril. On July 12, the British decided to throw the fear of God into the rebels and test their defenses by sending the Phoenix, a 44-gun battleship, and the Rose, a 28-gun frigate, past southern Manhattan and guns blazing. Undeterred by fire from the Manhattan shore, the two ships raced up the Hudson, peppering several New York rooftops with cannonballs and sailing by unscathed. The din from the shelling was deafening. Hamilton commanded 4 of the biggest cannon in the patriotic arsenal and stood directly in the British line of fire. Hercules Mulligan recalled, Captain Hamilton went on the battery with his company and his piece of artillery and commenced a brisk fire upon the Phoenix and Rose, then sailing up the river, when his cannon burst and killed 2 of his men, who were buried in the Bowling Green. Actually, Hamilton's exploding cannon may have killed as many as 6 of his men and wounded 4 of 5 others. Some critics blamed inadequate training for the mishap, but the general dissipation of troops addicted to whoring and drinking was more likely to blame. Lieutenant Isaac Banks reported that many cannon at the battery had been abandoned by troops who were at their cups and at their usual place of abode, viz., on the holy ground. Of the specific incident involving Hamilton's men, Banks wrote that by the carelessness of our own artillerymen, 6 men were killed with our own cannon, and several others very badly wounded. It is said that several of the company out of which they were killed were drunk and neglected to sponge, worm, and stop the vent, and the cartridges took fire while they were ramming them down. In other words, the men hadn't swabbed out the sparks and powder after the previous firing, that Hamilton was never reprimanded, and that his military reputation only improved, suggests that he was never faulted for the fatal mishap. However, crushed by the incident, he quickly learned that war was a filthy business. By August 17, New York's population stood in such grave danger that Washington urged residents to evacuate immediately. Only 5,000 civilians of a pre-war population of 25,000 remained, with the condescension typical of the British command. Lord House Secretary Ambrose Searle snickered at the rebel forces as the strangest that was ever collected. Old men of 60, boys of 14, and blacks of all ages and ragged, for the most part, composed the motley crew. Washington had dispersed his tattered forces across Manhattan and Brooklyn. After crossing the East River to scout the terrain, Hamilton doubted that the Continental Army could defend Brooklyn Heights against a concerted British onslaught. Hercules Mulligan recalled a dinner at his home, at which Hamilton and the Reverend John Mason agreed on the need for a tactical retreat from Brooklyn, lest the Continental Army be wiped out. After they had retired from the table, they were lamenting the situation of the army on Long Island and suggesting the best plans for its removal when Mr. Mason and Mr. Hamilton determined to write an anonymous letter to General Washington, pointing out their ideas of the best means to draw off the army. Mulligan transmitted this plan to one of Washington's aides, to no avail. Hamilton proved dolefully accurate in his predictions. On August 22nd, the British began to transfer a huge invasion force across the Narrows from Staten Island to Brooklyn. Within a few days, British redcoats and Hessian mercenaries on Long Island numbered around 20,000 or more, than twice the number of able-bodied Americans. Following a deceptive lull of the several days, the British soldiers then advanced north through quaint Dutch and English farming villages. Moving through marsh and meadow, they leveled homes, flattened fences, uprooted crops in their paths, and slaughtered the inexperienced American soldiers. They took different routes, but their common objective was to reach and breach the patriotic fortifications erected on Brooklyn Heights. Although Washington rushed in reinforcements from Manhattan, the Battle of Brooklyn turned into a full-blown fiasco with the Patriots heavily outgunned. About 1,200 Americans were killed or captured, dwarfing British losses, and it looked as if Washington's army was now trapped in a vice, with the British army in front and the East River at its back. The British had a chance to smash the revolt with one decisive blow. It is commonly said that Hamilton took no part in the battle, yet an unnamed correspondent for the Royal Danish American Gazette submitted a narrative of his own involvement. One suspects the dispatch was Hamilton's handiwork, through the author identified himself as a member of the Pennsylvania troops, along with Maryland and Delaware troops. Those soldiers were commanded by Hamilton's hard-drinking former patron, Lord Stirling, and they displayed great valor. In the words of Stirling's biographer, neither he nor anyone else would have predicted that this overweight, rheumatic, vain, pompous, gluttonous inebriate would be so ardent in battle. The St. Croix correspondent credited the bravery of Stirling's men, who defended a weak position but with few cannon to defend them. He also explained the strategy behind Washington's famous nocturnal retreat across the East River on the night of August 29th, saying Washington feared that British men of war would sail upriver the next day and sever his access to Manhattan. The author told how in a cold, steady drizzle, we received orders to quit our station about 2 o'clock this morning and made our retreat almost to the ferry when George Washington ordered us back to that part of the line we were first at, which was reckoned to be the most dangerous part. The reporters' company, stranded on a spit of land, crouched with easy musket fire range of the dozing British troops, but were screened by darkness and thick rolling fog. At dawn, the author and his men scurried safely aboard one of the last ships to slide away from the Brooklyn shore. In an exemplary act of gallant leadership, Washington waited for one of the last boats before he himself crossed the river. Despite this stealthy retreat, it seemed to the British that everything was proceeding according to the schedule, and that their amateurish American foes would crumble before force majeure. Instead of pursuing the rebels and pressing their advantage, the complacent British forces dawdled and botched an opportunity that might have ended the conflict. On Sunday, September 15, they tardily resumed their offensive with a sustained, ear-splitting bombardment of American positions at Kip's Bay, approximately between 37th and 38th Streets today, on Manhattan's eastern shore. So terrible and so incessant a roar of guns few even in the army and navy had ever heard before, said Lord House Secretary. As dozens of barges disgorged British and Hessian troops into the hilly wooded area, the Patriots' forces lost their nerve and began to flee in undisguised terror, discarding any semblance of discipline. On horseback, an outraged Washington tried to stem the disorderly retreat. Though Washington was famous for his composure, his infrequent wrath was something to behold, and he cursed the panic-stricken troops and flailed at the incompetent officers with his riding crop. Finally, he flung his hat on the ground in disgust and fumed. Are these the men with whom I am to defend America? Since the British dragged their feet and flailed Since the British dragged their feet and failed to give chase to the Americans running northward, most of the Patriots found sanctuary in the wilderness of Harlem Heights. Hamilton stayed cool under fire. Again, the story comes from the garrulous Hercules Mulligan. Captain Hamilton commanded a post on Bunker Hill near New York and fought with the rear of our army. Hamilton later confirmed this story indirectly when he testified, I was young. I was among the last of our army that left the city. Hamilton showed great fortitude and did not reach Harlem Heights until after dark, having walked the entire length of a thickly forested Manhattan in a drenching rain. He was very dispirited, later telling Mulligan that in retiring he lost his baggage and one of his cannon, which broke down. He had surrendered his heavy guns and his company's weaponry and had now been whittled down to 2 mobile field pieces that could be pulled along by horse or hand. As New York fell to the British, Hamilton and the ragged remnant of the Continental Army had little notion that they would be exiled from the city for 7 years. Redcoats poured into Manhattan and went on a rampage, annihilating the hated vestiges of dissent. They slashed paintings and torched books at King's College, which they used for a hospital. After midnight on September 21st, a fire started at the Fighting Cock's Tavern near the Battery, the flames leaping from house to house until this blazing conflagration consumed a quarter of the city's housing. Nobody ever solved the mystery of whether the culprit was nature or a renegade arsonist. The British, however, were convinced of rebel mischief and rounded up 200 suspects, including an American spy, Captain Nathan Hale, who was hung from the gallows at a spot thought to be near the present 3rd Avenue and 66th Street. Much of New York had been reduced to charred rubble. Despite this, thousands of desperate Tories flocked to the city for refuge, swelling its population and setting the stage for later conflicts with returning patriots. After the humiliating loss of New York, Washington thought the craggy, wooded area of Harlem Heights would shelter his army as a natural fortress. He nearly yielded to despair as he bemoaned the drunkenness, looting, desertions in the ranks, and short-term enlistments. In pleading with Congress for a permanent army, he voiced arguments that were echoed by Hamilton, and that united the two men in future years. To place any dependence upon militia is assuredly resting on a broken staff. According to Hamilton's son, it was at Harlem Heights that Washington first recognized Hamilton's unique organizational gifts, as he watched him supervise the building of an earthwork. It was also at Harlem Heights that Hamilton's company first came under the direct command of Washington, who entered into conversation with him, invited him to his tent, and received an impression of his military talent, wrote John C. Hamilton. It was yet another striking example of the instantaneous rapport that this young man seemed to develop with even the most seasoned officers. In late October, Hamilton fought alongside Washington at White Plains in yet another bruising defeat for the Patriots. The war was beginning to look like a farcical mismatch. The Patriots were a slovenly, dejected bunch, while the Redcoats in their trim uniforms and brandishing polished bayonets stepped smartly into battle to the inspirational strains of a military band. At White Plains, Washington posted the bulk of his troops on high ground while sending a separate detachment of about 1,000 men to the west on Chatterton's Hill, above the Bronx River. John C. Hamilton says that his father planted his 2 field pieces upon a rocky ledge at Chatterton's Hill and sprayed Hessian and British columns with fire as they struggled to wade across the river. Again and again Hamilton's pieces flashed, he wrote, sending the ascending columns down the river's edge. Soon the British regrouped, forcing Hamilton and his comrades to abandon the hill, and finally the entire area. Nevertheless, at White Plains, the British forces suffered larger losses than did the Americans, which provided a fillip to the dejected spirits of Washington's men. After White Plains, the Patriots, exposed to British sea power as well, had only a tenuous hold left on Manhattan. In the spring, they had built twin forts on opposite sides of the Hudson. Fort Washington on the Manhattan side and Fort Lee on the New Jersey side. On November 16, as he manned an observation post at Fort Lee, Washington gazed in dismay as a huge force of British and Hessian troops overran Fort Washington. Along with staggering losses of men, muskets, and supplies, the surrender of Fort Washington dealt with another devastating, nearly mortal blow to the fragile morale of the Continental Army. Washington was widely castigated for his failure to not safeguard the men, not to mention all the cannon and gunpowder stored at the fort. 4 days later, the Patriots had to surrender Fort Lee hastily to Lord Cornwallis, with his army having dwindled to fewer than 3,000 forlorn men. Washington had no choice but to retreat across New Jersey, with the vile epithets of his critics ringing in his ears.